Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I would first like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very interesting event, the Volkswagen Foundation and the Max Planck Society. As you may observe, the title of my presentation has changed a bit. When I was asked about 6 months ago to come here and present on biosecurity, I thought that this would be a rather straightforward task. Now, but after doing a lot of reading and researching and looking at opinions for the opponents and the proponents of gain-of-function research, it's, in my view, not a mainly or a priority to discuss the security aspects. I see this mainly as a biosafety issue and a general safety issue, though definitely there is the dual-use aspect of gain-of-function research, and of course there is the aspect, I would say, further down the line when it comes to managing risks of misuse. But as was said yesterday by Mahmoud, that the train has left, the research has been published, so of course the control over this is of course no longer in the hands of the researchers. I thought there was some questions from the audience yesterday about biosafety and biosecurity. So this is a picture that I usually use when I lecture within academia to try to distinguish biosafety and biosecurity, or actually to show how much they are interlinked. When you look at laboratory biosafety, these are the measures and procedures that you use to try to minimize the risk of accidental exposures and releases, or unintentional exposures and releases. While on biosecurity, you have the measures and procedures in place to reduce the risk of unauthorized access, misuse, theft, diversion, intentional release, and so on. But they are usually used in different contexts or described as being separate entities. I don't see this. I see this more as complementary components to containment. If containment is the central aspect, what you want to maintain, you have biosafety and biosecurity, and the human implementation of these to ensure containment. And they do share a lot of different aspects, such as inventory control, most notably access restriction. You can restrict access to people who have no business to be in a facility, but you can also restrict access to people who don't have the proper training to work with a certain pathogen, don't have the right immunizations, and so on. Accountability and compliance, of course, is equally important for safety and security. Incidents reporting and response is an extremely valuable tool for risk assessments. Evaluation and revision, it's not a one-off document or risk assessment, and then you can hold true to that one. And then, of course, education and training, which I think is one of the key components when discussing laboratory risks, both from safety and security. Now, Paul gave a really, of course, excellent presentation on biorisk-management. I'm using a different document to describe this. This is from the WHO Laboratory Biosecurity Guidance document of 2006. It says that biorisk-management is establishing systems and controls to provide the required degree of assurance that biosafety and laboratory biosecurity risks are appropriately managed, and the consequences of release of any pathogen or toxin from the lab is appropriately minimized. And I would like to stress the word minimized, because this is not about risk elimination at the end. So components of this, of course, the implementation and enforcement of biosafety and biosecurity measures, providing internal and external assurances that suitable measures have been adopted and are effectively implemented, and of course, providing a framework for awareness raising on these issues, biosafety, biosecurity, ethical codes of conduct, and the provision of training. Paul mentioned a lot of guidance documents. That's how it looks today. There's no internationally agreed norms on biosafety nor biosecurity. We've much more advanced on biosafety than we have on biosecurity, especially on the implementation, but there remains a lot of work on both areas to do. We do have national regulation and implementation based on some of these guidance documents. Perhaps most notably is the NIH guidelines on research involving recombinant or synthetic nucleic molecules, which was revised last year. This NIH guidance is, of course, mandatory for implementation for NIH grants. The setting up of institutional biosafety committees and so on. We also have two major documents from the WHO. We have the Laboratory Biosafety Manual in its 3rd edition. We also have the Laboratory Biosecurity Guidance document. And as Paul mentioned, we have within the EU the CEN Workshop Agreement. I'm sorry, it should be the later version than the 2008 version, which is the Laboratory Biorisk-management Guidance document. And again, it's still at the level of being a guidance document. And then we have, of course, perhaps most commonly known, the CDC's BMBL in its 5th edition, which is usually the common reference framework for risk classification and BSL classification requirements. And then we also have Health Canada's Laboratory Biosafety Guidelines in the 3rd edition, which is very comprehensive and differs a bit from the BMBL. If we look at the laboratory risks, we can categorize them into two major components. We have the unintentional and accidental risks. These are addressed mainly by biosafety measures. And then we have the intentional, which is addressed by biosecurity measures. For the purpose of this talk, I would like to focus mainly on the unintentional and accidental risks, give you a couple of case examples. Some of these were presented yesterday as well, some figures as well, and focus on that part. Now, if we look at the types of accidents that occur, we have containment failures. These do happen. And these are usually due to poor maintenance, improper use, and of course to factors which lie outside anyone's influence. We have, of course, the laboratory-acquired infections, which is a combination of many things: poor planning and execution of experiments, taking shortcuts. Stress is a big factor in this. Poor training, or good training can actually reduce stress, of course, and also not avoid promoting taking shortcuts. And also we have negligence, which is quite common as well. When we look at intentional, we have, of course, unauthorized access, and this is usually the result of poor physical security and poor biosecurity policy enforcement, and a lack of understanding of the security, or the security culture, if you will, among those that work in those places. We have theft and loss, which is a result of unauthorized access. Poor inventory controls delays the discovery that something is missing. And of course, we have the misuse aspect, which usually is connected to the scenarios of intentional release or similar. If we look at laboratory-acquired infections, I'd like to highlight two main publications. The most famous work was from Pike, way back in 1979, who did an analysis of laboratory-acquired infections between 1924 and 1977. In this publication, he identified over 4,000 laboratory-acquired infections with 168 casualties. Now, in a more recent study in 2006, between the four, that analyzed these infections over the period of 1979 and 2004, there were 1,448 infections resulting in 30 casualties. This is a significant improvement. We've done major improvements when it comes to good laboratory practice around the world, though, of course, there remains a lot of work to do. Now, if you look at the number, 1,448 doesn't sound like much of a reduction. But we also have to factor in that we are a lot more people working in labs today. And the later publication was based on reviewing 270 articles in scientific publications on laboratory-acquired infections during that period. Now, we have a couple of notable cases. Between 1963 and 1978, there were smallpox infections at two accredited laboratories in the UK. There's an excellent paper from this year written by Martin Formansky, a US forensic pathologist, looking into a number of releases and laboratory-acquired infections I can highly recommend. It was published in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And then perhaps more relevant when we talk about pathogens of pandemic potential, the 3 SARS coronavirus laboratory-acquired infections in 2003 to 2004. In Singapore in 2003, there was a doctoral student working in a BSL-3 lab that got infected. His West Nile virus sample was co-infected, was cross-contaminated with SARS. In Taiwan, the same year, there was a researcher in a BSL-3 lab that tried to clean up a spill and got infected with SARS. And the most serious case, of course, is the one in Beijing the following year, where 2 researchers got infected, likely because of an incomplete cold inactivation of SARS. And this led to 9 confirmed cases with 1 fatality and 3 seroconversions. So there you have a consequential release. When it comes to accidental releases, there was a report on its way of being published, or being partly published in the UK by the Health and Safety Executive, which reports 70 serious incidents at government, university, and hospital labs. In 2011, there was the Center for Disease Research and Policy report that detailed 395 potential release events of select agents between the period of 2003 and 2009 in the US. Now, a couple of notable cases, of course, Purbite has been mentioned a couple of times yesterday. The FMD outbreak, or foot-and-mouth disease, in 2007, which was due to a number of circumstances which led to release and an outbreak in the local farms. And again, as Paul mentioned, the animal BSL-3 labs are the ones which carry the highest risk. Also to mention is that the Purbite plant, following this and after they'd taken measures to reduce the chance of this occurring again, they've actually received 10 complaints. They are now moving into new facilities, so hopefully there will be improvements. We also have the Venezuelan equine encephalitis outbreak in 1995 and 2000, which has been attributed in literature to possible failed vaccines or not attenuated vaccines as a potential source. We have, of course, the anthrax release from Compound 19 in Sverdlovsk, a potential bioweapons development project in 1979, which has been attributed to potential faulty ventilation or actually lack of a filtration in an open stack. Again, I could reference Furmansky's work on this. Or actually, the original work is Messelson on this, which was published in Science, I think. Furmansky also covers this, which I can highly recommend. And of course, what was discussed yesterday is the unknown source of the 1977 H1N1 outbreak, whether the source is from a lab or from a person. So if we look at the common causes of accidents and releases, and also the Pike's work from 79 still holds very true. The most common source of laboratory-acquired infections is through inhalation, percutaneous inoculation, direct contact, and ingestion. I thought when I read this that ingestion, perhaps, thinking about the time period that Pike's work goes back to 1924, maybe mouth pipetting was one of the components, but it still holds true today as being one of the major pathways. In the Health and Safety Executive Report, loss of containment is reported as the major event for BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs, which would be expected, of course, with a Purbite incident. But if we look at the different causes, I mean, there are failures in a multitude of areas. Procedure, of course, the human factor, infrastructure, lack of training, which influences also the implementation of procedures, and the safety culture. The US Government Accountability Office released a report in July this year with a quote, "The risk from accidental exposure or release can never be completely eliminated, and even laboratories with sophisticated biological research programs, including those most extensively regulated, has and will continue to have safety failures. As long as you have facilities operated by humans, built by humans, you will have these events happening." It's that simple. So if we look at high containment laboratories, if we take into mind that, especially also that Paul said BSL-3 labs being of potential or more serious concern than BSL-4, we can look a bit about, we can look a bit on the number of labs out there. In the UK, it's an estimated of just over 600 BSL-3 labs. In the US, and I've seen a lot of different figures, the one I think would be more accurate is the 1,495 described and declared in the US. But most of them, actually many of them, remain undeclared because it's not a federal requirement to keep a registry of them. Of course, if not, you're working with select agents. So the global number is anybody's guess, but let's say between 4,000 and 10,000. Could be even more. When we look at BSL-4, there are 59 labs declared worldwide, and there are likely more which are undeclared. There are 24 in Europe, there are 15 in the US, there are 10 in Asia, there are 2 in Africa, we have in Latin America, we have in Canada, we have in Belarus, we have in Russia, Australia. So if we look at laboratory containment of pathogens of pandemic potential, we have the EU directive for highly pathogenic avian influenza to be under BSL-3 containment. We, of course, have the pandemic H1N1 from 2009, which is to be, the containment level is to be determined on a national basis. And this perhaps is a reflection of the SEN workshop agreement of individual risk assessments. We have also the new USDA, APHIS, and HHS guidelines for H7N9 for BSL work or for BSL-3 work and enhanced measures, especially in regards to working with infected animals. But there are a couple of caveats that was alluded to in the previous presentation, of course, that BSL-3 and BSL-4 designations have very wide interpretations internationally. The BSL-3 lab that we find, for example, in Sweden, where I am and where I've trained, might be extremely, or is very different in, for example, Morocco, if you will. So there are different interpretations and implementations of these BSL-3 and BSL-4, so you cannot really use that as a stamp of approval, if you will, about the containment measures. And of course, it's the procedures inside and how the humans work in there, which is the most key importance. And also the BSL-3 plus that was mentioned, it notes that you have taken some additional measures above what's the baseline requirement following the BMBL. But this is not well defined in the BMBL, and it's very much open to interpretation and ambiguous. Examples of such enhancement could be enhanced respiratory protection for the personnel. It could be HEPA filtration of dedicated exhaust air from the labs. It could be airtight dampeners for lab isolation and so on. Laboratory effluent to contamination such as kill tanks. And of course, advanced access controls. Biometrics is mentioned in BMBL. And this was also covered a bit yesterday on the risk analysis on gain-of-function experiments looking into these PPPs. As we know, the 18 pending gain-of-function experiments. The likelihood of accidental escape, there are 2 major publications on this. Merler, which was mentioned yesterday, the average risk of 0.3 per lab per year. And of course, with the number of labs out there, this does increase. Also, Klotz and Clevestig 2012, an estimated at the time 42 facilities working on these pathogens, mainly H1N1 and SARS-CoV. And they estimated that, or through their calculation, that there's an 80% chance of a release from one of these labs, which is under a period shorter than it would be between influenza pandemics. Also, in 2010, the United States Department of Homeland Security made a risk assessment for the National Bio and Agri-Defense Facility. And their estimation is that there's a 70% risk over 50 years of an FMD release, which puts it at about 1.4% chance per year. So, of course, the base question is, what is an acceptable level of risk? Mark mentioned, or Paul mentioned that we can eliminate risks by not doing the experiments. But of course, if we decide that these experiments should go ahead, of course, we need to decide on what is the acceptable level of risk, if that is possible. And among these arguments, I think also with the background of all these labs working on this, I think Simon put this quote: "Research published from these laboratories may facilitate the replication and extension of risky research in less stringent control settings," and that's very true. We might have the utmost standards in Europe and the US in our labs, but again, it's not the same thing in many other countries that might actually take an interest in pursuing this work by themselves. And I think that's the primary concern, at least that's my opinion. Also, the issue of risk assessments of pathogens was discussed in the previous presentation, that in Europe we are actually, with the CEN workshop agreement, moving away from lists, if you will, of pathogens and which biosafety level classes they belong to. If we look at the strains results, or we look at pathogens resulting from gain-of-function research, of course there's a number of different aspects to take into account which are affected by the original BSL assessment factors, of which there are mainly 11. And all these marked in red are affected in one way or the other by adding new traits to them, which makes risk assessments a bit more tricky perhaps, or which actually does lead to one considering a higher level of containment or different approaches. So challenges that I can see, of course, is can we accurately risk assess pathogens and outcomes from gain-of-function experiments? Do we take the precautionary route that all these experiments are conducted under BSL-4 conditions? Again, it's been proposed in literature that maybe these, if they are deemed valuable, that they should proceed, that they should be done in select BSL-4 labs, perhaps somewhere rural where the impact of a release would be minimized, that people working there, staff, would be quarantined before leaving. So a lot of different suggestions. And also, can containment ever be guaranteed, even in BSL-4? No. That's at least my opinion. Infrastructure, you have ventilations, kill tanks, equipment, physical access barriers, power management, anything can fail. Staff compliance, which is the key, I think, which is, as Paul said, we can make infrastructure, we can make fairly reliable, but again, the human factor will always be the Achilles heel. Of course, developing standard operating procedures, training, the culture of safety and security, but most importantly, stress factors. I don't know how many have been in a BSL-3 lab even, but it is actually quite stressful sometimes. And environmental factors, things that we do not control. Perbrite is a good example. There was a combination of many things which led to the release of foot-and-mouth disease. Flooding was one of them. All right, I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clevestig, for this interesting talk and implying as well an opinion on certain things. Are there any questions?
You mentioned that stress is a very important factor for failures. Scientists nowadays work in a very competitive environment, which might lead to stress. So what's your suggestion to reduce the stress?
Well, actually, I think that stress working in the laboratory environment is fairly straightforward by training. And from my own experience, training is something, even in biosafety, is still lacking, especially in academia. There's a great need for awareness raising of risks, both from accidental and also misuse, if you will. I think that I've been the administrator of the Karolinska Institute Institutional Biosafety Committee, so I've planned and performed a lot of training for students and researchers. And unfortunately, the numbers of people participating is reducing. And I don't have a good explanation why. But there's always a need for, when it comes to stress, usually it's poor planning. And of course, there's a lot of pressure on scientists today to raise funds for their work, and then to actually do and deliver on that work, of course. But when in the lab, one should focus on the objective of being there, especially in an environment such as BSL-3, and most importantly in a BSL-4 as well.
There's room for one more question. No further questions. Thank you. Okay, sorry for this.
Sorry, it's one of those question comments, and I'll be brief. I just wanted to pick up on the two speakers. I think this is an important comment, that too much biosafety is discussed with biosafety professionals, sort of preaching to the choir. And also in your talk, you picked up on this notion of a culture of biosafety. And I think this is a major catchphrase and probably an opportunity. So I wonder if any of you have some ideas on how are we going to have a global movement to improve the culture of biosafety and security. Any ideas now or later? Appreciated.
From my part, if I'm going to answer that, well, it's difficult. But having been engaged in, for example, the European Biosafety Association meetings and so on, there's, if I go back in 2008, there were pretty much just European countries. But now every year there's an increase of other member states, or member states and states outside of the European community engaging, North Africa, Middle East, and so on. So actually, I think that is happening in a slow but steady path, I guess.